Well, hello everyone, and welcome to yet another edition of Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I will introduce our special guest, Ben Cort, here in just a moment after I do some quick logistics. I'm Laura Stack. I'm blessed to be the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, where our mission is to educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high THC marijuana on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide ideation. This session is being recorded. If you are watching this recording, please share it with your friends and family using the link where you are watching it. We do have a handout. It is either on the page where you're watching this recording or it is in the handout section of your control panel if you are watching this live. Ben will present for about 45 minutes here, and then he will take questions at the end. So there is a question box. If, as you think of questions, please type them in so that we don't have to wait for everybody's questions. I will read them in the order that they are received at the end of our presentation. So without any further ado, Ben Cort has worked in many nonprofits, hospitals, and private programs. He's been a leader inside many forms of addiction treatment and prevention. From 2017 to 2020, he was a consultant to various treatment programs, state governments, professional and collegiate athletics, and labor. He is now CEO of the Foundry Steamboat Springs, which is an inpatient treatment program for men in the mountains of Colorado. Ben is a junior fellow at the University of Florida inside their Drug Policy Institute. He's a board member for NALGAP, which is the National Association of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Treatment Providers and their allies. He's a board member of SAM, which is Smart Approaches to Marijuana, and a board member of SAFE, which is the Sober AF Entertainment. He's also a faculty at numerous institutes. He's a published author of Weed Inc., published by Simon & Schuster in 2017, and his TED Talk, Surprising Truths About Legalizing Cannabis, has been viewed over 2.5 million times. Ben Cort, welcome, and thank you for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
My pleasure, Laura. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you very much for what you do, for all that you've done for our state and for all that you've done to keep the memory of a beautiful young man alive. We're lucky to have you around here, Laura.
Thank you, Ben.
I think, hopefully, a lot of you who are here were a part of the initial talk that we did together last year, at the end of last year, with Johnny's Ambassadors. And if you weren't, well, you're going to be lost a little bit. I'll try and I'll do a little bit of a recap. But what happened last time was, as my time management skills were evidenced to be as poor as they are, we ran out of time and I had to skip through quite a few things. So this is just coming back to cover those things that were skipped over, as well as to give you plenty of opportunity for questions, because I think that a lot of the times when we have conversations on this subject, everybody's experience with it, I mean, it's most of us are here because of experience rather than curiosity, and our experience, if there's anything that I can do to help answer any questions around that, I certainly would be happy to. So bear with me while we do a little bit of a review here. Oh, this is she already read most of that, so we'll skip over it. What I want to emphasize first, and again, if you saw this, the original presentation, you heard this part before, but I've got to cover this first. We absolutely have to make sure that you understand that this is the new school of cannabis. This is not what you smoked in the 70s. And I feel like this is said often nowadays, almost ad nauseum nowadays, but it's so important that we understand just what we mean when we're talking about it being the new school of cannabis. So again, for those of you who saw the last one, sorry for the brief review, but you've got to understand this basic premise. So first off, there are 200 and some chemicals inside of the cannabis plant before you light it on fire. The 500 and some while and after combustion. It's kind of interesting how that stuff works. But of all of those chemicals inside of it, there are two of them that are by far, in a way, the most important. The one not listed here, of course, is CBD. A component of the plant that's totally non-intoxicating. It doesn't have a whole lot of downside associated with it. There are a few if you use it too much, and it's where the vast majority of the medical properties of the plant exist. But the conversation we're having today isn't about CBD. If you have specific questions at the end, please feel free to jump in. I'm not a subject matter expert on it, but I might know enough to answer some of them, or at least direct you towards some resources. What we're going to talk about today is that other chemical component of cannabis, which is THC, and the reason why it matters so much. So THC, of course, is the psychoactive component inside of cannabis. If you don't have THC, you have hemp. You have a really interesting textile. You have the product that makes my favorite pair of shoes. You have something that no matter how much of it you consumed, you wouldn't get high. No THC, no intoxication. More THC, more intoxication. Pretty simple. It's a little oversimplified, but it'll work for right now. So the market that we built in Colorado and that everybody has followed suit with is a market that is built on the sale of THC rather than the sale of cannabis. And I think it's pretty important that we, as educated folks in this world, start to change our vernacular around it a little bit. Laura was generous enough to publish an article that I wrote not too long ago about how important it is to change our vernacular around this, and it's on the website. If her website, if you want to take a look at it. By calling something and by saying that something is cannabis, we imply that it is whole plant, that it is the thing that humankind has been interacting with for millennium. When we switch that out a little bit and we talk about the commercial market as a commercial market that supports the sale of THC, the intoxicating part of the cannabis plant, it's much, much more accurate, and it'll help us to both understand as well as to push back on what this THC market is. So I think these are the last review slides. Oh no, maybe one more after this, but you've got to understand this part. It's incredibly important. For 50 years, the University of Mississippi maintained data on the average THC potency from all confiscated marijuana by law enforcement in all 50 states. And it looks like this program is actually going to resume again. Unfortunately, it ended in 2010, giving us a little bit of 2011 data, but it lost its funding. But it would appear that this program is going to begin again, which will be incredibly helpful and important. But I'd like to just point out a couple of things for you here. If you look at the beginning of our THC measurement, hopefully you can see my cursor moving around here. If you look at the beginning of their measurement, you will see that line is pretty close to zero, that the marker is. And were you to extend that line forever back to the very, very first time that the cannabis plant ever showed up in nature, if you extended that line back forever, it would always be about the same, because what naturally occurs inside of cannabis is somewhere between a 0.2 and a 0.5% THC. That's what we have always interacted with. There's an old joke among the cannabis consuming community that says that the most dangerous part about weed is getting caught with it. Because before we started to change the laws, you could get into some trouble. Like when I was using, you could. And for the most part, that was fairly true. It certainly wasn't. If any of you read the book, excuse me, Tell Your Children the Truth about cannabis, mental illness, violence, something like that. You know that a case is made for cannabis to have been doing intense things to the human brain and body way, way back when. But the instances of that were very, very rare. We didn't really start to see issues associated with cannabis use until it started to get more potent. So, I'm sorry, I got a little scratch. So if you see this line, you'll notice beginning in 1960 and ending in 2010, 2011, cannabis got steadily stronger. And that was because we like to get high in this country. And we realized if by breeding more of that THC into the plant, we could get higher quicker. Of course, that's the way the market pushed it. So I'd like to show you how crucial it is that we remember how much has changed here by the illustration of this next slide. So before I jump, just look at increments of 2.5 over the course of 50 years. So the blue is when we add Colorado in. Colorado is the blue. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're going to have the ability ever, unless the state makes some mandates to report on that after 2015. We know that we can get a couple of ideas from the Marijuana Enforcement Division's report. And we know that the average THC last year reported in 2019 reported inside of the commercial market was 64 point something, but we just don't know anymore because our state, actually the woman who put this information together and gave us this slide and was a whistleblower on this issue is no longer able to report on it. Long and terrible story, but the state isn't requiring the collection of these data anymore. All that aside, I want you to look at the difference. Oh, I can't move this thing. There it is. This green line, this thing that we're seeing here, when this plant became this drug, everything changed. Everything that we knew about the treatment of cannabis use disorder changed. Everything that we knew about cannabis-induced psychosis changed. And the scramble that there has been inside of my professional community to keep up with this, I mean, it's a race because we're always being outpaced. While on the other hand, there's a bit of an arms race going on inside of the THC industry to get as much as possible into the products that they're selling. And I need to explain the why on that, because this is where a sound understanding will help us get a better feel for what's going on with our kids too. I like to say that this is what happens when we go from a good gardener to a good chemist. When it goes from the people who were growing the thing that they were smoking to the millionaire who owns multiple programs and would never touch cannabis himself, but employs a whole lot of great scientists to make his cannabis the strongest thing that there is. And I say his intentionally because I believe that there are only 2 female-owned dispensaries No, there's more than that. There are only 2 African American owned dispensaries in Colorado that I know of. I'm not up to date on that in the last year. And certainly a tiny minority of female owned facilities. It's an industry that's absolutely dominated by wealthy cisgender white men. Let's shift a little bit so I can convey to you the importance of understanding. You've got to understand that cannabis is addictive, that the THC is addictive. So if you say that addiction is a disease, and you cannot arbitrarily diagnose a disease. You have to have criteria met. And for anyone to diagnose addiction, or more properly, substance use disorder, a person has to meet criteria. So there are 11 of them set forth in the latest version of the manual that tells us what to do. If a person meets 2 or 3, they would qualify as having a mild substance use disorder. 4 or 5, it's moderate, and 6 and above, it's severe. What I am about to show you is how dependent the THC industry is on the person who has a severe substance use disorder, so meets 6 or more of these objective diagnostic criteria. I'd also like to point out that for the first time ever, that the manual that I mentioned, the DSM-5, in the last version of it, they gave us objective diagnostic criteria for cannabis withdrawal. So I'd like that to sink in for just a minute, that it has changed so much and gotten so strong that we now have to treat the physical dependence of THC and treat people who are physically withdrawing from THC. That's nuts. Like that has never been a thing before. And the reason why it's never been a thing before was because when it was a plant, the human body wasn't getting dependent on that plant to a point where it would physically withdraw if you took the THC out of the system. But as the THC has increased so high and so quickly, we found ourselves in a position where people are actually experiencing the physical withdrawal from THC, and that's needing treatment alongside of everything else that we got to work with them. And since there's so little known about that, for those of you who have experienced a loved one who has gone through this, or who has gone through early recovery from cannabis, and maybe it just didn't feel right, or it was incredibly intense for them, and this might have been going on, it'll make sense, and hopefully it'll justify it a little bit when you say, wow, they were actually physically withdrawing and dependent on this. The idea that was even possible would have been laughable 10 years ago. Nobody would have taken you seriously if you said it. And now it's something that the treatment programs, well, certainly mine and all the other ones I know, we treat daily. Now, from the industry standpoint, and from the person who's selling this product standpoint, something that you can get physically dependent on is a very, very good thing. We'll get to that in just a second. But again, for those of you who have had loved ones go through this, or know people who might need to go through it, I want to just give you a little bit of, here's a little bit from behind the curtain. THC addiction is very, very real. Again, there's objective diagnostic criteria, and it is not easy to treat. I, in my book, quoted an addictionologist, a physician whose world is addiction psychiatry, as saying, And she would rather treat an intravenous heroin user who'd been shooting dope for years than somebody who'd been dabbing for a couple of months. And part of the reason why it's so difficult for us to treat, well, there's a multitude of reasons. One of them is because the treatment community often knows very little about it ourselves, because so many people in the treatment community come from a background like mine, experience. We've had firsthand experience. We got sober, we got out, and we decided to get into this professionally. We tend to minimize the effects of cannabis because we apply our own bias to it. Our bias of, I got sober in 1996, so what's the big deal? It's just weed. The other thing that's really, really difficult about treating the THC addict is that any other substance that you say you have an issue with, and in fact, even most other behaviors that you say you have an issue with, um, everybody's going to rally around you. Like just think of this: if somebody in your life said, "I can't stop drinking. I've been using heroin. I'm addicted to amphetamines. I can't stop gambling." We would all take that very, very seriously. So would everyone around them, because they know people who have lost everything, and plenty of people have lost their lives to some of those things as well. Where we would say, well, we're so proud of you. Good on you. Let's go get you help. You got a problem with the bottle. Let's get the bottle set down. The opposite actually almost happens a lot of the times with the THC dependent person, because when you think about the narrative that's out there and that has been forced onto these young people. I mean, you ask them, if I'm giving a talk to young people, I will tell you that is the first question I'll get. I could probably write down the first 5 questions I'll get most of the time. They all come from the Drug Policy Alliance, which is funny. If they knew how hard they were getting played, I think they might push back a little bit. But the first question is always, well, since it's not addictive, or since it's never killed anybody, what's the big deal? And the problem that the person faces when they raise their hand and say, "Hey, help, I have a problem, I believe I'm addicted to THC," is their entire community is going to push back and say, "Okay, whatever, that's not even a thing. You can't be addicted to that." And it's interesting. A lot of the times they end up kind of projecting their own fears and insecurities around it, saying, "Okay, if that person has an issue, maybe I have an issue, and it's way easier for me to keep towing this line." But the reality is that they have been fed that line from go, from the very first time that they heard about marijuana. They heard about it in a light that was non-addictive, non-lethal. So for the person to ask for help, it's intense. So treating THC addiction often requires very long stays in treatment, as well as somebody who can do a really nice job working with the antipsychotic medications that are required, because very rarely does the THC addicted patient not need antipsychotic medications, because a lot of the times they come into treatment in a period of psychosis or following a period of psychosis. So you got to have a really good doc who gets it and who can work with them. And as many of you know, unfortunately, insurance providers don't really like to pay for treatment. And so to be able to even get 30 days out of an insurance provider is a miracle every time it happens. And you would, I'm waiting, the lawsuit's going to happen. And when it does, hopefully I'm going to be at the very front of it. The pushback that you get from an insurance company trying to get somebody inpatient care for a THC addiction is ridiculous, because they just don't want to pay, but they're saying, hey, they can't die from it. It's just weed. It's just weed. It's just weed. So traditionally, rates of addiction to cannabis were about 10%. So roughly 1 out of every 10 people who consumed it would at some point in their using career develop a diagnosable dependence on. The rates today, as of a really elegant study published in October of last year, show that that actually looks a little bit more like 30% as potency increases. So roughly a third of everybody who uses today's high potency THC will at some point meet diagnostic criteria for addiction to it. And that's pretty intense. And the last point I'd like to make about treating this addiction is that many of the patients who come in with a THC addiction, they need physical detox and acute medical intervention. And since so much of the medical community outside of emergency departments is fairly aloof when it comes to this, it makes that very difficult. And so what you end up with is a lot of people kind of bombing out of treatment before it even gets started, because we are not doing a good job of managing the physical detox at the very beginning of it. There's a book written by multiple physicians called Cannabis and Medicine: An Evidence-Based Approach, published by an organization called Springer. It's a medical textbook. It's required learning for all of the med students in our country as of this year. And I got to co-author a chapter in it on the treatment of THC addiction, recovery from, and treatment of. And for those of you in my field who are interested in that, Dr. Letitia Bader and I took a pretty deep dive into what it takes to actually treat somebody for a THC addiction. And I think we came up with some interesting stuff. So check that book out. All right, so let's get to the crux of this talk, which was what's up with the kids and why does this matter for those of us who are particularly concerned with youth. So when we first opened our retail sales, there were fewer than 300 cannabis facilities in the state of Colorado in 2014. By the end of 2017, that had increased by a multiple of 4. And by the end of 2019, almost a multiplier of 10. So at the end of 2019, Colorado had 2,700 licensed cannabis facilities. And we've got to ask ourselves how we can support that amount of retail. And there have been a lot of people who I've seen overcomplicate the answer to this. It is very simple. The only way that you can support this amount of retail is if there is a consumer base for it. So the only way that you can then continue that growth is if you grow that consumer base. There's only 2 ways to grow that consumer base. You convert current users to more frequent users, or you capture new users. That's it. Convert current users to more frequent users, capture more users. So inside of the prevention world, and we have 60 years worth of data from SAMHSA that's shown us this, the old 80-20 rule has always taught us that for addictive substances in this country, alcohol, tobacco, about 80% of the product is consumed by about 20% of the consumers. So the analogy I like to give you there is that my wife and her couple of margaritas a year mean nothing to the alcohol industry, but the guy who found Mad Dog 2020 when he was 12 years old, I was a solid prospect for the future. Now in Colorado, we actually have half decent data about this. This is from the 2019 Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division annual report. We saw that about 6.1% of all of the users in Colorado, 6% of the users in Colorado were purchasing 75% of the THC products in the state. And I would go back, if you don't mind, a couple of slides, and I would ask you for a word or two that describes that 6.1%. And if we remove the pejoratives from it, which I think we're doing better at when it comes to talking about addiction, we would say things like dependent person, addict. Those people are, I would guess, every single one of them. Maybe there's an exception or two from people who are diverting it and selling it, but every single one of them would meet the diagnostic criteria for severe substance use disorder. And if they're purchasing 3/4 of all of the product in this state, you could better know, and we had all better recognize, that the industry knows that better than we do, that they know who their customers are who are actually paying the bills, that 6.1% had better be cultivated so that they can keep them engaged, and they had better be drawn into purchasing more, and they've got to do everything they can to add numbers to that. Because as we can very plainly see by that statistic, that this is an industry like every other vice industry with any addictive potential that is driven by addiction. And it's sad to me that because we thought we were being so thoughtful and progressive and cool in the way that we were thinking about it, that we thought that the weed industry would be different. They would be different from big tobacco, from big alcohol, from the folks south of the border. There's never was any reason to think that it wouldn't look like this, that a new industry with addictive potential would target addicts. It's pretty simple math. If you want to build somebody inside of that 6.1%, you want to make the person with a severe substance use disorder, there are 3 factors. Well, there's a fourth, genetic predisposition, but we can't really do anything about that yet. The 3 factors are age of onset, frequency of use, and THC potency. How early can they capture a user? How frequently can they get them consuming? And how strong of a product can they get into their bodies? That's it. And this information is well known, well understood, and completely and totally factual, that if you want to create a problemed user, age of onset, frequency of use, and potency of THC. That's it. So a very brief tour through Colorado, because I want to spend a little bit more time talking about some other things and then also answering questions. It seems like I'm doing a bit of a better job managing time than last time, Laura. So I can have a minute to explain some of this stuff to you. I've got a couple of pictures, just a few. I have a file on my computer with about 700 of these, and I've actually got a Dropbox file that I add to periodically. I don't think I've put anything in it in a year or so, with all these pictures that I give anybody who wants to have copies of them. But I really like 700 pictures of really blatant and disgusting disregard for the law and targeting early users, frequent use, and high potency. And here are a couple of them. So this was a dispensary in Colorado Springs that, until they got a cease and desist from Sesame Street, they had Cookie Monster on the side of their dispensary carrying a plate full of dope. And just look at all of those images. You've got fresh fruit, Cookie Monster, ice cream, candies, and cookies. They are not going to ever sell THC to some 5-year-old who walks in and is excited because Cookie Monster's on the side. He couldn't walk in. I go to dispensaries all the time, and if you have, you got to show your ID at least 2 times. But what this is long-term normalization in association with things that kids will always identify with. You remember, some of you who come from my age demographic will remember Spuds McKenzie, Joe Camel. We got Camel Cash and all the cigarettes that we bought, and using animals and cartoon characters to brand tobacco. I mean, eat your heart out. These guys actually poached an image from Sesame Street to brand their THC with. These are a bunch of candy bars, and there's just so many variations on these. But here's a couple from our friends at HIDTA, the high intensity drug trafficking area. Some pictures of THC specific candy bars that are very clearly made to mimic candy bars that we know and love. Instead of Butterfinger, it's Buddha Finger. Munchie Way instead of Milky Way. There is in the Apple store, in the iTunes store, a Kushmoji set, which I would encourage you to get. I'm going to actually give you a couple of apps to get. I would encourage you to get the Kushmoji set because these are all THC specific emojis. And the reason why I'm encouraging you in it is that so much of, I mean, listen, 420 is old news. Everybody knows what that means now. However, there's a lot of imagery that gets used today, and I think for parents gets used right under our noses that we don't know. So you can probably learn a lot from that. The other one that I would suggest that you get if you're interested in talking about this and fighting this stuff like I am is the Weed Maps app. The Weed Maps is a company run by a gentleman who refers to himself as the Philip Morris of pot. I'm not kidding, he does. And it's got a geolocator in it, so you can see where all your closest dispensaries are, and it'll give you coupons for them. It'll tell you when there's sales going on around you, and it also shows all of the delivery that's going on, which is the new world that Colorado has entered. But the reason why I like to see that is I think that it shows good trends in what is being consumed based on what the sales and things are. And you can really keep up to date on what's going on in the market with your Weed Maps app. The other one that was just brought to my attention the other day was an app called Weed Inc. that I've got to call my publishers about because that was the name of my book. And so they thought maybe I could get them to stop selling that app. But anyway, this is clearly not an app for those of us in our 40s or 50s or 60s. This is for kids. This was amazing. Mile High Pipe and Tobacco runs some of the most incredible advertisements. I see them all the time, but I thought this was just so classic. This is a back to school special, which, come on. This was something that happened personally to me that I thought was pretty noteworthy. A couple of years ago, my daughter was going from 8th to 9th grade, and my son from 6th to 7th. And so one was going from junior high school to high school, and the other from elementary school to junior high school. So at their school, they were given this insert out of the Boulder Daily Camera. I mean, not like some college paper. This is the Boulder Daily Camera because we're an open enrollment county, so it has all of the information about the high schools and when they're in middle schools and when their open houses were. So they gave them this handout in school. So my daughter comes home, goes into her room, comes up a few minutes later, and she says, "Dad, check this out. This is, that's the first page of the handout for the open houses, which if you see is 1/3 of the page is a color ad for a dispensary called Starbuds." And she said, at first I thought that it was for Starbucks, and then I realized that it was for weed. Wow, that's pretty brilliant marketing. You co-brand it with something that demographic knows and loves, which is Starbucks, and you put it in front of every single juvenile set of eyes in the county in a place that they trust, which is school listings. Here's a move-in special at CU Boulder, clearly targeting freshmen and sophomores. We have, these are, I mean, everywhere, spring spring break specific advertisement. So again, just going for kids. Here's a Santa Claus with a bag full of dope that comes on. I get all these ads that pop up on my phone and pop up in my emails because of what I look at, and I also sign up for all of them so I can keep appraised of it. There was Christmas a couple of years ago when good old Mile High changed out baby Jesus with a dab rig. And then as far as frequency, this was a campaign that Sweet Leaf ran for almost 3 years, and they have been put out of business by the state, not for this, but for some other egregious things that they were doing. But this was everywhere. I saw this on billboards, on taxis, all of which are illegal, by the way, but who's going to enforce that? Smoke weed every day. And it'd be hard to overstate how damaging that is, even for the adult brain. But for the pre-myelinated frontal lobe, for the kid, for the under their mid-20s, not only will this lead to a pretty good chance that you're going to end up with a dependency on it, it'll do some pretty detrimental things to your brain. No one should be smoking today's THC-rich cannabis every day, ever. In fact, the only reason that would ever be a good idea is if you're making money off of it. And we have these, I'd encourage you, those of you in Colorado or other states with legal rec, to look at a lot of the advertisements, because a lot of them, the attempt is to normalize THC use everywhere. I've got a bunch of ads of people on climbing trips saying for THC. So the images of a climber, and then they're like, okay, you should get high and do this. And as a climber myself, well, I guess former climber at this point myself, I'll tell you that it's probably not a good idea to do that. But it's the idea that no matter what you're doing, it can be enhanced with THC. And this particular advertisement, where it says at the bottom, don't forget to dabble daily. So dab, of course, is the verb of concentrate consumption, which again, if you're not familiar with, you might want to go back and look at that last webinar that we did together. And then we have like just such ease of use. This is just for smoking. If any of you have seen the presentation that I do on edibles and vaporizers and the different and how easy it has become to just consume those around the clock without anybody ever noticing, you know that this is almost a little bit antiquated. We have made ease of use really different than it ever was before. You can take a sip of weed or THC infused water. You can pop some THC gum in your mouth. You can have a THC spray or lotion or whatever. And then get back to this idea of no matter what it is you're doing, however you're recreating, you could probably recreate better if you were high, or have more fun if you were high. So frequency of use. And then for potency, I don't really have to get too into this because it's just what it is. But here's an interesting little section from the Dear Stoner category in Westward, where the reader says, how can I easily request the highest potency strains of a product? And the answer is, if you'll skip down to this a little bit, bud tenders are trained to have their most potent products at the ready when asked for a suggestion. And it's true because, again, I go to dispensaries often and I ask these questions often. Why are bud tenders trained to have their most potent products at the ready when asked for a suggestion? Obviously, so that we can get an increased potency inside of a person who we really, really hope is young and we really, really hope is going to consume all the time. Because if they are, then we've got a chance of growing that 6.1% number. There's a teddy bear advertising it riding over the Rockies. So look, I'm going to go to questions. So hopefully you've got a couple. There are so many different resources out there. I'll give you a couple of ideas. Here's SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, and SAMHSA. Smart Colorado is a great resource for us here. I also strongly encourage you, and I'm sorry that it's not up on the slide. I thought it was. to stay up to date on Laura's website, on Johnny's Ambassador's website, because she does a really nice job as well. And I'll tell you, for those of you who are interested in trying to stay on the cutting edge, I subscribe to just about every single pro cannabis and commercial cannabis thing that there is out there, because it keeps it fresh and I can keep learning. If you are interested in a not so great book, but maybe one that says some important stuff in it, there's a copy of mine, which Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all of that business. And with that, I will turn it over to questions.
All right. Ben, I just love how you tell it like it is. And you are matter of fact, very calming presence, I think is very helpful. This is it. This is life. This is what we are struggling with and exactly what we need to know. I'm getting a lot of questions, and I want to reassure everyone that I will be providing links to everything that you mentioned. So don't worry, I'll have links to the book, the medical book, the different apps, the white paper you wrote for us on You Don't Know Anything About Weed. We'll have links to the various apps as well as the Dropbox file. So I will make sure all of that is available, because you're getting a lot of questions about that, Ben, and a lot of thanks. Okay, let's see. Nadia says, I want to understand the difference between synthetic THC and plant-based THC. Are they all boiling down to the same chemical that affect your brain in the same way? And is this synthesized in a lab like other drugs are? Thank you.
Complex question, Nadia. I'll give you a brief and then give you some resources for it. So a lot of the times when we say synthetic marijuana, we are not actually talking about synthesized THC. We're talking about, it's kind of a throwaway term for a lot of designer drugs and ones that are kind of sold under the radar. So when somebody says synthetic marijuana, they're for the most part talking about something very different than just THC. We can, however, synthesize THC. It is doable, and in all likelihood, it's the future of this industry, because then we won't have to grow it anymore. But synthetic marijuana, synthetic cannabis, is very different than what we are talking about here today. It interacts with the body differently. It's frankly quite a bit more dangerous.
Is that spice? Someone asked, is that spice?
Yeah, it's referred to, there's a million ways they'll refer to it: spice, bath salts, etc. But like any of those kind of designer drugs that are sold under the synthetic marijuana umbrella are very, very dangerous substances, quite a bit more than just high potency THC.
Okay, and I've seen recently how you can buy THC in crystals and freebase them, and they look very similar to crack. It's
well, that's the majority. That's the majority of the market by dollar figure from last year's MED report. It's not the majority by weight, but it definitely isn't. And so those are concentrates, different forms of. And again, if you're not familiar with what that is, we covered it in the last talk.
I'll put a link
also
to
written
that.
on it.
Yeah.
But
okay. Good.
those concentrates, big deal.
All right. Doug wants to know, can medical cannabis, like CBD only, he specifies, can that help with anxiety? I know Doug lives in Canada. He says, teens, I think if they have anxiety, it will help if they use marijuana, but should they be using pure CBD to help with the anxiety versus THC, which he understands causes anxiety? So which way is it? And can actual CBD help with that?
So Great question, Doug. So the reality is that CBD has some really nice anti-anxiety properties associated with it. In fact, Journal Psychiatry, I think, early summer, late spring of last year, there was an article in it saying we think that there will be a new round of anti-anxiety and potentially antipsychotic drugs that are come from a synthesized CBD. And so that's one side. And you are exactly correct in saying that the other side to it is that THC is contraindicated for use when somebody has anxiety, be that chronic anxiety or acute anxiety. It makes it worse. So the problem is that the narrative has become you use weed to treat anxiety when you do not. And just like so I kind of put this in the personal decision category. I'm a pretty big fan of FDA approved drugs. I tend to not do a whole lot of stuff from Whole Foods and things like that.
Herbal, yeah.
When it Yeah, medicines that I take. But the thing is that if you could actually find CBD that we knew was real CBD and not, right, because there's no regulation around it, you can say, I mean, this is a CBD shirt, but like nobody can prove otherwise. Um, there's a case to be made for it with anxiety. However, we have a lot of really good pharmaceutical grade things that we use to control people's anxiety rather than this. So it can be a really tricky thing for kids. And to not to beat this too far into the ground, but the other intense thing that happens a lot of the times is acute anxiety is one of the most pronounced things that comes from somebody's detox from THC. So a lot of the times what will happen is somebody will say, I need this to control my anxiety, because when they stop using it, their anxiety gets so loud. But that would be the same thing as the heroin addict saying, I need this to control my vomiting and my shakes that I get. When it's not, it's just keeping the signs of the detox at bay. So you never ever put THC in with anxiety, and be very careful mixing CBD with. And if you're going to, if you got to, use a pharmaceutical grade CBD product, Epidiolex, Marinol, Sativex, etc.
That you actually know is CBD versus someone saying this is a CBD distillate, and you read the label and it says 80% CBD. So you're like, I wonder what's the other 20% if
Yes.
there's zero THC, right? Bro,
Right.
butane? What? Okay, let's see. Tom asks, what type of marijuana data suppression are you seeing within state DPH and the MJ commission offices? And secondly, what are the most important? What do you think? Like, is it marijuana use, lab testing, violation, or sales? What should we be demanding from our local and state representatives? So if you want to be an advocate, what kind of data are you seeing suppressed, Ben, and what should we be asking for?
Lab testing. Lab testing.
Okay.
That's the most important. So it's been 4 years since the state of Colorado has tested products that are for sale for purity and pesticides, butane, etc. It's been 4 years. So
Irresponsible.
it's irresponsible. It's foul. It's going to cost a lot of money. Is the problem to actually really do this? And it was a pretty nefarious thing that happened 3 years ago, where the state lawmakers mandated that it was only the state who could do these take these measurements, and then it couldn't go out to anybody else. And then when that happened, the state lab actually didn't even have the precursors in state to measure potency of things, and that just started the whole thing. And eventually, it was just kind of like, screw it. So what we have to have is the Marijuana Enforcement Division. I mean, there's a couple things that have to happen. There's got to be a law that's put into place that makes it illegal for anybody from the Marijuana Enforcement Division to go and work for the industry then, because that's where they all go. I mean, the first head of the Marijuana Enforcement Division now owns a major cannabis compliance consulting company that's
No
worldwide.
conflict of interest there.
Right. Right, the first person who ran MD as a, yeah. So that would be the first thing that we have to do. And then after that, we have to allocate a really significant amount of the tax money. The problem is in the allocation of the tax money. It goes into the general fund, which is already predetermined. We've got to allocate a significant amount of it for the testing, and then mandate reporting that's more than just this report, 30-page report we get from the Marijuana Enforcement Division annually. It was one of the biggest problems that we had in this at the beginning, is there was no mandate for data reporting.
You know, it's shocking
Canada's
that they are willing to sacrifice our teens' mental health and lives on the altar of taxes. You know, it's disgusting. It just, you know, and even the lab testing that's done, you know, it's not even required that when there is a youth suicide that they do toxicology. I mean, even in 2018, the last year for which we have data, we know that ages 10 to 18, that 36% of them had THC in their systems. And that's only the ones who were tested, Ben, and only the ones who were not using at the time, but still had psychosis and suicide. It's, I think some bills need to be put in place. Tom, I hope that answers your question. Sorry, Ben.
That's why I like working with you. You keep up on it. Yes, you're exactly right. You're 36%. Exactly right.
Okay. Regarding enforcement, then, George wants to know, what is standing in the way? If it's illegal, it's illegal. Period. You know.
Sure.
And we know
what's standing in the, what's standing in the way is manpower. I mean, you can't, so you ask any brass in police in the state of Colorado, and they'll say, we're absolutely inundated with THC. We can't do anything other than. And so there's no opportunity for them to proactively enforce things like advertising bans, like, well, we don't have any restrictions on potency, but if we were to have that, how would we actually enforce it? We don't have and didn't dedicate resources to give law enforcement the ability to actually crack down on this stuff. So I can send you, I mean, I've sent pictures. I remember 5 years ago, maybe I gave a picture to a sheriff friend in town in Weld County of a dispensary that was doing 24-hour drive-through, which was totally illegal in that county. They couldn't sell it after 9 p.m. And they went and they issued them a citation. But the other issue is that Amendment 64, if they even have the bandwidth and they go and they take the time to give them a citation, Amendment 64 specifically limits the amount that citation can ever be. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's pennies. I mean, it's like, it can't be above, even if it's like 15th citation, it can't be above $1,500 or this.
Well, and
so even that's why this law was written by the lobbyists for the cannabis industry, not by the consumer.
And even if we could go and get more manpower and hire more sheriffs and try to crack down, I mean, even the way the system is set up with no tracking, it's not like it's opioids. You know, you can go buy from several different shops, or what's coming in Denver, have delivery service from 3 different delivery services, and no one is the wiser. And oh, wait, it's legal for an 18-year-old to get a medical marijuana card. So I think for $500, I'll go buy one as a senior in high school for chronic migraines, and then sell it to everybody else in the high school who's 14 years old to get them hooked. And oh, look, I'm their new dealer. So you can't enforce that because it's a loophole and it's legal. It just makes me sick.
That's the crux of is that it wasn't this law. We voted, we thought it was a simple up or down. It's 3,666 words that we added to our state constitution. and most people have absolutely no idea what's in it. And
I would
it was a
dare to say
law
that.
that was drafted.
Did people even know what they were voting on in 2012? They certainly didn't know they were going to get this 8, 9 years later.
Laura,
Well,
I think I got time for one more because I got to
yeah,
go
I
jump
was
on
going
an
to say,
airplane. I'm going to
you
leave the
have to
DIA after this.
go fly away. Let's see. La la la. Are you seeing Colorado lift up the marijuana industry for tax revenue during COVID-19 like they are here in Washington State? We will leave that as our last question.
Well, sure. It was designated as an essential business in Colorado, as it was in Washington. There's some Freedom of Information Act requests that I anticipate before way too long that our governor will have to face about his own financial interests inside of this industry. Because, yeah, we can't keep schools open, but we can keep dispensaries open. Come on, people. Come on, let's do the math. Like, I will always come back to Occam's razor with these things. The simplest solution is more than likely the correct one. And the simplest solution in this is it's all about the money, people. It's all about the money.
Ben, you have once again enlightened us. I enjoy being your friend. I like you so much, and you're so smart. And your wisdom is really helping our community. And I want to genuinely thank you for your time and your talent. And hopefully you'll come back again.
Gladly. And everybody go see Jay Voigt's presentation at the end of this week. I got sober with that guy, one of my dearest friends, and I'm sure he'll give a great talk. I was excited that you had him, Laura.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for the plug for Jay. I'll put that link out, everyone, too. And again, thank you all for being Johnny's ambassadors. Love you all. Appreciate your time. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.